I had a stroke on a Tuesday morning, alone on my kitchen floor, and when the paramedics finally reached my daughter-in-law by phone, she told them to try again after the weekend because she and my son were already halfway up the mountain and the ski conditions were finally perfect. When I woke up 3 days later in the ICU, the chair beside my bed was empty. It stayed empty for 11 days. They came on day 12, not to check on me, but because my son needed the company credit card number and thought it would be easier to get it in person. My hospital room door was standing open when they arrived. My bed was made. The monitors were dark. And on the nightstand sat a single envelope with my son's name on it. When he opened it, his hands started shaking. I watched from the hallway. I wanted to see his face when he realized that the man he had left to die alone had already decided to leave him behind instead. My name is Edward Calloway. I am 67 years old, and for 31 years, I ran Calloway Regional Freight out of a cinder-block building on the outskirts of Lexington, Kentucky. I started with 2 trucks and a folding table for a desk. I ended with 48 trucks, 12 full-time drivers, and a logistics contract with 3 regional hospital networks that I was genuinely proud of. I built that company with my hands and my stubbornness, and a lot of $5 diner coffee in the back corner of a booth while the rest of the world slept. My first wife, Helen, used to say I loved that company more than I loved sleep. And she was probably right, but she said it with a smile because she understood. Helen understood everything. She passed 12 years ago, pancreatic cancer, 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end. After Helen, I was alone for 4 years. Then I met Sandra at a charity dinner and made the most expensive mistake of my life. She was warm and funny and beautiful, and I was lonely in a house that still smelled like Helen's garden roses no matter how many times I repainted. I convinced myself that starting over was not a betrayal. The wedding was small. My son, Derek, was there. He smiled and shook my hand and told me he was happy for me. I believed him. That was 8 years ago. The Tuesday it happened, Sandra was already in Colorado. She and her sister had flown out Thursday to spend a long weekend at a friend's condo in Telluride. Derek and his wife Melissa had driven up to meet them Sunday evening, making it a proper family trip. The kind where everyone posts photos on social media and uses words like grateful and blessed. No one had asked if I wanted to come. The trip had been booked for 2 months. I had signed the check for the condo rental myself because Sandra had presented it to me over dinner as a done deal, and I was too tired to argue. I stayed home. I told myself I preferred the quiet. I was in the kitchen making oatmeal when the left side of my body stopped cooperating. The spoon clattered into the pot. I grabbed the counter with my right hand, but my left arm was hanging like a coat sleeve with nothing in it, just dead weight. The room tilted. I went down slowly, like a building that has been compromised at the foundation. I remember the cold linoleum against my cheek, and I remember thinking very clearly, get to the phone. I could not get to the phone. I lay on that floor for 22 minutes before my neighbor Roy, a retired mail carrier who walked his beagle every morning at the same time, noticed my front door was open and came to investigate. Roy called 911. Roy rode in the ambulance with me because there was no one else. Roy sat in the waiting room for 4 hours while the stroke team worked, and when the admitting nurse asked for my emergency contact, Roy gave her the only name he knew, which was Sandra. The nurse reached Sandra at 11:47 in the morning. I know the exact time because I later requested the call log from the hospital. I have read that log many times. Sandra answered on the second ring. The nurse explained what had happened with the clarity and urgency the situation required. She used the words, ischemic stroke, and critical window, and family should be present. She told Sandra that I was stable, but that the next 72 hours would determine the extent of any permanent damage, and that having family nearby mattered in ways medicine could not fully quantify. Sandra said she understood. Then she asked how long the drive was from Telluride to Lexington. The nurse told her approximately 22 hours by car, or she could fly. There were likely same-day flights through Denver. Sandra made a sound that was not quite a sigh but not quite a word either. She said, "Look, Edward is strong as an ox. He has been through worse. She said the doctors were there, and they knew what they were doing. And honestly, what was she going to do? Sitting in a waiting room. She was not a medical professional. She said she had already paid for the ski lessons on her credit card, and they were non-refundable. The nurse, a woman named Patricia, whose voice I would later hear on the recording and want to personally thank, said very quietly, "Ma'am, your husband may not be the same man when he wakes up. You may want to be there." Sandra said, "Well, if something changes, call me back. And tell Derek when you reach him. He handles things." She hung up. They called Derek next. He and Melissa were on the mountain. He called back 40 minutes later. Derek listened and then said, "And I have read this transcript so many times I could recite it in my sleep." He said, "Okay, but is he actually dying right now? Or is this more of a wait-and-see situation? Because if it's wait and see, I don't see the point of us blowing up the whole trip. Melissa already has altitude sickness, and we drove 14 hours to get here." Patricia told him it was serious. Derek said, "Tell him we're thinking of him. We'll check in tonight." They did not check in that night. They sent a text to my cell phone, which was sitting powered off in a tray at the nurse's station. The text said, "Dad, heard about the stroke. That's scary. Rest up. Talk soon." There was a prayer hands emoji at the end. I was unconscious for 3 days. Roy visited twice. My pastor came once. The chair beside my bed was empty every time I surfaced from the dark and looked for a face I recognized. On day 5, I could speak in full sentences again. On day 7, I could stand with a walker. On day 9, the physical therapist named James, a young man with patient eyes and a grip like a vice, told me I was recovering faster than he expected, and I told him I had reasons to get better, and I meant it in a way that had nothing to do with optimism. On day 9, I also called Frank Harmon. Frank had been my attorney for 22 years. He was not warm in the way people mean when they use that word about a person. He was precise and methodical, and he had an absolute intolerance for people who wasted his time or mistreated his clients. When I called him from my hospital room, my voice still slightly slower than usual, my left hand still unreliable on the touchscreen, he picked up immediately. He listened without interrupting while I told him everything. When I finished, there was a brief silence. He said, "Edward, are you sure about this?" I said, "I have been sure since I woke up alone on day 3 and found a text message from my son with a prayer hands emoji." Frank said, "I will need 48 hours. I said, "You have 36. What Frank put together in those 36 hours was the result of 22 years of knowing exactly where every asset I owned was legally situated. The house was in my name, predating my marriage to Sandra, protected by the prenuptial agreement she had signed, with barely a glance, because she trusted that I would always be there to take care of things. The business had been transferred 18 months earlier into a holding trust I had created during a routine estate planning review. A review Sandra had not attended because she had a hair appointment. Derek had a seat on the company advisory board, a title with no legal authority, and a modest honorarium I paid because I had been trying, for years, to make him feel included in something he had never actually contributed to. Frank initiated the removal of Sandra from every joint account. He revoked Derek's advisory board status and canceled the business credit card issued in Derek's name, the card Derek was presumably planning to call me about when he arrived. He had the locks changed on my house, and the house in Hilton Head that Sandra considered hers by emotional right. He arranged for a private physician to document my cognitive status with the thoroughness of someone who anticipated that cognitive status would be challenged in court. On day 11, a Tuesday, exactly 1 week after my stroke, I checked myself out of the hospital. James gave me a folding cane I did not intend to use for long. Patricia walked me to the elevator and shook my hand, and I could tell she wanted to say something but kept it professional. Roy picked me up at the main entrance in his truck. I stayed 2 nights at a hotel 8 blocks from the hospital. Frank visited both evenings. We worked. On the morning of day 12, I went back to the hospital. Not as a patient. I used a side entrance and found an alcove near the ICU waiting area, where I could see the corridor without being immediately visible. I wanted to watch them arrive. I needed to see what it looked like when they finally showed up. Sandra came in first, pulling a small wheeled suitcase because she had not bothered to go home first. She was wearing ski clothes, a cream-colored jacket with a fur-trimmed hood, and the kind of sunglasses that cost more than Roy's truck payment. She looked tanned and rested. She walked to the nurse's station, with the authority of a woman accustomed to being attended to. Derek and Melissa were a few steps behind. Derek in a fleece vest, Melissa on her phone. Sandra announced herself to the nurse at the desk. She said she was there to see her husband, Edward Calloway. The nurse checked her screen. She asked Sandra to confirm the name. Sandra confirmed it, with a slight impatience in her voice that I recognized from every conversation she'd ever had with service workers. The nurse said, "Mr. Calloway was discharged this morning." Sandra blinked. She said, "I'm sorry?" The nurse repeated it. Sandra turned to Derek. Derek stepped forward, suddenly more alert, and said, "Discharged where?" "He had a stroke 11 days ago," the nurse said. "He was medically cleared and discharged at 8:15 this morning. He left this for you. He left this for you. He left this for you." She held out the envelope. It was a plain white envelope, the kind you buy at a drugstore. Derek's name was on the front in my handwriting. Derek took it carefully. The way you take something when you are not sure what it contains but you are already afraid. He opened it. He unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. I had written 3 paragraphs. I had written them with my right hand, because my left was still unreliable. But the words were clear. I did not call you dramatic when I lay alone on my kitchen floor. I did not ask you to come home after the ski lessons were over. I did not text you a prayer emoji when I needed a face I recognized in the room. I have spent 30 years building something real, and I have spent the last 8 learning that some people only value what they can take from it. I have decided to stop making that easy. Do not try to reach me. Do not go to the house. Frank Harmon will be in contact with instructions for the return of company property. I hope the conditions were worth it. Sandra read it over Derek's shoulder. The color left her face in a way that had nothing to do with the altitude. Melissa stopped looking at her phone. Derek said, "This is insane. He's not well. He doesn't know what he's doing." He pulled out his phone and called my number. I watched him from the alcove. I watched his expression shift from anger to confusion when the call went straight to a message saying the number was no longer in service. He tried again. Same result. He tried Sandra's access to our joint account through her banking app. I watched her face when the balance loaded. $11. I had left $11 because I was 67 years old, and I had earned the right to a small indulgence. Sandra sat down in a chair in the corridor. She sat down the way people sit when their legs make the decision before their brain catches up. She was pressing her hand against her mouth and staring at the floor, and for a moment I almost felt something. Then I remembered Roy sitting alone in a plastic waiting room chair for 4 hours, and I felt nothing except a quiet, settled resolve. I left through the side entrance before they thought to look around. I had arranged a rental house in a suburb of Nashville. Nothing grand. 3 bedrooms, a yard, a gas grill on the back patio. Frank had a contact there, a property manager who asked no questions and kept excellent records. I drove there myself, which my doctor would have preferred I not do. But my right hand was steady, and I kept both eyes forward, and I arrived in one piece. I unpacked my single bag. I made coffee. I sat on the back patio and watched the light change over the neighbor's fence, and felt the specific silence of a man who has finally stopped pretending. Frank called at 7 that evening. He said, "They went to the house. The locksmith's call triggered a property alert, and the monitoring company sent me a notification." I asked what happened. Frank said, "Sandra tried her key, and when it didn't work, she called a locksmith, who refused to drill without owner authorization. Derek apparently told the locksmith he was the owner's son, and was told that did not constitute legal authority. There was some shouting. The neighbors called the non-emergency police line. Officers came, confirmed the property was secured under valid owner instruction, and asked them to leave. I said, Where did they go? Frank said. The Hilton Head House, I said. And, Frank said, the property manager there received formal notice this morning. Change of access credentials, effective immediately. They arrived, found the code no longer worked, and are currently, based on my last update, at a Holiday Inn, about 4 miles away. I thought about Sandra in a Holiday Inn. Sandra, who had once complained for 40 minutes about the thread count at a 5-star resort in Scottsdale. I thought about Derek calling the front desk to ask if there was a way to upgrade. I thought about Melissa on her phone, searching for something that would fix this. I poured a second cup of coffee. The legal action came on day 19. I had expected it. Frank had prepared for it. Derek had found an attorney, a man who specialized in elder law and had apparently built a minor reputation on contested capacity cases. The petition argued that my stroke had left me cognitively compromised, that I was making impulsive and reckless financial decisions that endangered myself and the family estate, and that temporary conservatorship should be granted to Sandra and Derek jointly to protect my interests while I recovered. It was well constructed. The attorney had obtained a retrospective psychiatric evaluation from a doctor who had never met me, and had based his assessment on hospital records and a written statement from Sandra, describing episodes of confusion, paranoia, and erratic behavior dating back months before the stroke. The statement was detailed and specific, and almost entirely fabricated. Sandra had a talent I had underestimated, which was for making the invented sound inevitable in retrospect. Frank sent me the filing on a Thursday afternoon. I read it at the kitchen table in Nashville, with a glass of water, and the steady attention I used to give contracts before I signed them. When I finished, I called Frank and told him to accept service and not to request a continuance. I wanted the earliest possible hearing date. Frank said, "Edward, I need you to understand that if they put Sandra on the stand, she is going to be credible." I said, "I know." Frank said, "She lived with you for 8 years. She knows how to tell a story about you." I said, "I know that too. Let her tell it." What Frank did not know, and what I had not yet told him, was that I had spent the last 10 days doing something other than resting. I had been making calls. I had been reviewing records that I probably should have reviewed years earlier, but had avoided because being betrayed by someone you have trusted is something you put off acknowledging for as long as possible. The company accountant, a careful woman named Donna who had worked for me for 14 years and whom I had spoken to twice from my hospital room, had flagged something 8 months earlier in a routine audit note. I had read the note and set it aside because the amounts were not large enough to alarm me at the time, and I had not been ready to look closely at what it implied. I looked closely now. Over a period of 16 months, 31 checks had been drawn on the company's secondary operating account. The checks ranged from $4,000 to $19,000. They were all signed with my name. I had not signed a single one of them. Donna had the originals scanned and sent to Frank, who sent them to a forensic documents examiner in Cincinnati. The examiner's report came back in 6 days. The signatures were forgeries, consistent with the kind of deliberate imitation produced by someone who had practiced from a genuine sample. The checks had been deposited into an account belonging to an LLC registered in Tennessee 18 months ago. The LLC was called Ridgeline Ventures. Its registered agent was Derek Calloway. I sat with that information for a full afternoon before I called Frank. Frank was quiet for a long moment after I told him. Then he said, "This changes the nature of what we're walking into that courtroom with." I said, "Yes." He said, "Edward, this is not just a family dispute anymore." I said, "I know. File what needs to be filed." We go to court on their timeline. The hearing was set for a Thursday morning. The courthouse was a federal building downtown, the kind of place designed to make everyone feel slightly smaller than they actually are. I arrived early, dressed in a charcoal suit that I had owned for 6 years and that still fit exactly right. I did not carry a cane. I walked in steadily, signed in, and found a seat in the gallery behind the defense table. I had specifically asked Frank to keep my presence out of the procedural filings. Sandra and Derek knew I would be represented. but they did not know I would be there. They came in together. Sandra in a dark gray dress, Derek in a suit that was slightly too new, Melissa behind them. Their attorney, a trim man with an efficient manner, arranged his papers and conferred with them in low voices. Sandra kept her expression carefully sorrowful. Derek looked composed in the way of a man who has convinced himself he is doing the right thing, which is perhaps the most dangerous kind of wrong. The attorney opened with the argument Frank had previewed. He spoke of my stroke with clinical sympathy. He described my behavior in the aftermath as the pattern of a man no longer capable of sound judgment. He presented the psychiatric evaluation with the gravity of scientific consensus. He told the judge, an older woman with reading glasses and the particular patience of someone who has heard every version of every story, that my family was not motivated by financial interest, but by love and genuine concern for a man who was vulnerable and alone. Sandra took the stand first. She spoke about our marriage with warmth and detailed affection. She described mornings I had supposedly not remembered, conversations where I had been confused about dates or people's names, a dinner where I had called her Helen twice. She said it with grief in her voice, not anger, which was the right choice, and I could tell she had rehearsed it. She said she blamed herself for not seeking help sooner. She looked at the judge and said she only wanted me safe. Derek followed. He was measured and factual in tone, sticking close to the business narrative. He described my decision to remove him from the advisory board as abrupt and inconsistent with my previous statements about the company's future. He described the financial moves Frank had made on my behalf as the actions of a confused man being manipulated by his attorney. He did not raise his voice once. I noticed that he did not look toward the gallery. His attorney rested. The judge asked Frank if he wished to respond. Frank stood and said, "Your Honor, the respondent would like to address the court directly, if the court would permit." The judge looked over her glasses and said, "The respondent is present?" Frank said, "Yes, Your Honor, he is." I stood up. I walked from the gallery through the low gate and up to the front of the room. I heard Sandra pull in a sharp breath. I heard Derek say something under his breath that his attorney immediately covered with a hand on his arm. I stood in front of the bench and looked up at the judge, and I felt clear in a way I had not felt in a long time, possibly years. I said, "Good morning, Your Honor. I apologize for the staging. I thought it was important for the court to see that the man being described in those documents can walk into a room on his own and speak without confusion." The judge looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "Mr. Calloway, you are represented by counsel. Your attorney should be conducting this proceeding." I said, "I understand. I only wanted to say one thing directly before the evidence is presented. If the court will allow me 30 seconds. She said, 30 seconds. I turned and looked at Derek. I said, "I was on the floor of my kitchen for 22 minutes. My neighbor's dog found me. Not my family. My neighbor's dog. No." I turned back to the judge. I said, "The rest, I'll leave to my attorney." Frank presented the forensic analysis methodically and without drama, which was the right approach. He put Donna on the stand, and she walked through the accounting discrepancies with the precise language of someone who had worked with numbers her entire adult life and did not mistake them or embellish them. The forensic examiner testified by video, his Cincinnati office visible on the screen behind him. His conclusions stated in language that was unambiguous. 31 checks. $187,000 over 16 months. Ridgeline Ventures LLC. Registered in Derek's name. Deposits. Confirmed. Derek's attorney objected twice. Both objections were overruled. I watched Derek's composure disintegrate the way a building does when the load-bearing support is pulled, not all at once, but in progressive, irreversible stages. By the time the examiner finished, Derek was leaning forward with his elbows on the table and his hands covering the lower half of his face. Frank introduced one final piece of evidence. It was a photograph, printed on standard paper, clear enough to read the details. It showed Derek and a woman I did not recognize seated at an outdoor table at what appeared to be a restaurant. They were holding hands across the table. The woman was wearing a necklace I recognized because I had purchased it. A rose gold chain with a small diamond pendant that I had given Sandra for our 3rd anniversary, and that Sandra had given to Derek, she said, to have it repaired 8 months ago. It had apparently been repaired and gifted to someone else. Sandra's grief face dissolved. What replaced it was not anger exactly. It was something more total than anger. She looked at Derek, and I could see the exact moment she understood that she had not been an accomplice. She had been a tool. I did not enjoy that moment. I want to be accurate about that. There was no satisfaction in watching it happen. There was only the sensation of something becoming true that had been true for a long time without anyone being willing to say it out loud. The judge dismissed the conservatorship petition with prejudice and referred the forgery matter to the county district attorney's office. She did it in the flat, procedural language of someone who has rendered judgment many times and understands that the language of the court is not the language of closure, only of consequence. Derek was not arrested in the courtroom. That came 3 weeks later, after the DA's office completed its review. He was charged with forgery, fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty. Melissa filed for divorce the following month, and I was told she moved back to her mother's house in Indiana. Sandra and I divorced. The prenuptial agreement held. Her attorney argued that it had been signed under duress and without adequate independent counsel. The judge reviewed the circumstances and found no evidence to support either claim. Sandra had signed willingly and with full knowledge. She received what the agreement specified, which was less than she had spent in 8 years of treating my accounts as a personal expense fund, and nothing from the estate she had assumed was accumulating in her direction. I did not watch any of it from a distance this time. I attended every hearing. I sat in the gallery, and I was present, and I did not flinch when they looked at me, because I had decided some time ago that the ability to be looked at without flinching is the only inheritance that matters. The company sold 8 months after the trial. I had been considering it for years, and the stroke had clarified what the years of consideration had not. I was done. I sold Callaway Regional Freight to a regional logistics group for a sum that made Frank exhale loudly over the phone and then apologize for unprofessional conduct. The drivers received retention bonuses. Donna received a package that reflected 14 years of discretion and accuracy. The cinderblock building on the outskirts of Lexington was torn down, and I did not go to watch because I had already said goodbye to it in the way that matters, which is quietly, in private, without an audience. I live now in a town on the coast of Maine that I had visited once with Helen, briefly, on a road trip the summer before she got sick. I remembered the smell of the harbor and the way the light hit the water in the early morning, and I had been carrying the memory for 12 years without knowing what to do with it. I did something with it. I bought a house 3 blocks from the water with a porch that faces east and a kitchen with enough room to actually cook in, which I have learned to do with the patience that apparently takes 67 years to develop. Roy and his beagle visited last July. We sat on the porch for 3 evenings and talked about nothing particularly important, and it was the best company I have had in years. I told him that what he did, walking his dog at the same time every morning and paying attention to an open door, had saved my life. And he shrugged in the way of a man who considers basic human decency unremarkable, which is the rarest kind of man there is. I received 1 letter from Derek, written from a correctional facility in Oldham County. It was 2 pages long. The first page explained why what he did was not really his fault. The second page asked if I would consider speaking to the judge on his behalf. I read both pages carefully because I am not a man who dismisses things unread. And then I folded the letter and placed it in the recycling bin and went back to the porch and the coffee and the light on the water. I have not received anything from Sandra. Helen used to say that grief and freedom sometimes feel identical at first, and that the only way to tell the difference is to wait and see which one lifts. I understand what she meant now. The weight I carried for 8 years, the one I had mistaken for love and responsibility and family, has lifted. What remains underneath it is lighter than I expected. It is not emptiness. It is room. The harbor is loud in the morning. There are working boats and pleasure boats and the occasional seal that shows up on the dock pilings and refuses to be moved by anything short of a serious commitment. The diner 2 blocks up makes coffee the old-fashioned way, which means strong and served without ceremony. I have a regular table by the window. The woman who owns the place is named Gloria, and she has been running it for 30 years, and she does not make conversation unless you start it, which I consider a profound service. I am not interested in anyone's pity for what happened to me, and I am not interested in anyone's admiration for what I did about it. I am only interested, now, in the particular honesty of a life that costs what it actually costs. Helen taught me that. The kitchen floor and the empty chair taught me to listen. I walk to the harbor every morning at the same time. Sometimes the light is good and sometimes it is not, and it is always worth the walk. I am 67 years old, and I built something real with my hands and my stubbornness, and I gave away everything I built, except the part of it that was mine from the beginning. That part no one can take. That part I carry to the water every morning, and I hold it there in the cold, clean air, and I let it breathe. If you have ever felt like the only thing your family saw when they looked at you was what you could provide, leave a comment. Tell me where you are watching from, and tell me if this story sounds familiar. It is not a comfortable story, but the uncomfortable ones are the ones worth telling. Hit like, subscribe to Revenge Saga, and stay with me. There are more stories coming. There are always more stories.